Welcome, Temple family, to another edition of The Road Ahead. Thank you for being here. I am Frederick Morton Jr., founder and chief executive officer of Tempo Networks, and I am pleased to have you join us here on Tempo Live for what is sure to be a riveting discussion on one of the most important topics impacting the Caribbean and indeed the world, the topic of reparations and addressing the grave impact of slavery, which resulted in privilege for the descendants of slave owners and a legacy of unimaginable hardship for the descendants of slaves. Reparations is about addressing this extraordinary crime against humanity, making the very reasonable case against the colonial empires, including the United Kingdom, Portugal, France, Spain, Holland, that profited greatly from the slave trade, and to assist in solving the myriad of problems created by the injustices of this dark chapter in human history. We are privileged to have with us today a very distinguished panel of experts to help us parse through the thorny issues arising in the reparations discussion. In moderating, I am joined by my esteemed co-host, who you know very well, my good friend, Mr. Hugh Riley, partner at the PM Marketing Group and former Secretary General of the Caribbean Tourism Organization, whose first duty will be to introduce our esteemed guest panel. Hugh, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Frederick. Thank you very much. Our distinguished panelists have long resumes, so we'll keep the intros very short so that people can later on go online and find the resumes. So let's get going. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, is a world-renowned academic, author, and historian who has written and spoken extensively on the subject of reparations, particularly from the Caribbean and European points of view. In Barbados, we say that Sir Hilary is often quoted in the three Ps: in private, in public, and in Parliament. Dr. Ron Daniels is well, in Parliament in the UK too, I'm sure.
Parliament worldwide.
Worldwide. Dr. Ron Daniels is an author and political science professor at York College of the City University of New York, and as president of the National African American Reparations Commission, he is extremely well versed on the subject and is able to speak at length, certainly from a US point of view as well. Dr. Hilary Brown represents CARICOM on the panel. As an economic grouping of 15 English-speaking, mostly independent countries, CARICOM has taken the regional lead on reparations and represents the consensus of its member governments. Dr. Brown is the administrator of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and during the course of this discussion, we'll probe the role of CARICOM in placing these kinds of very difficult issues on the global agenda. So, Dr. Frederick Morton, this is a very tall order. How should we proceed?
Indeed, indeed. Well, yes, it is a tall order. And let me just say a warm welcome to the entire panel. Hi, everyone. All right, so yes, good afternoon. Well, first let me say, Hugh, that the topic of reparations we know is one with many tentacles, and therefore we will only be able to, in this time allotted, provide an overview, really, of the most important and salient points regarding reparations. We are excited, however, to let everyone know that the exploration of this topic and the dissemination of information from Tempo Networks will become a part of the strategic plan of the network. So we intend in a major way to partner with the CARICOM Reparations Commission to have an ongoing series of discussions aimed at educating the Caribbean on this very important topic. So this is just the beginning, folks. Tempo for Reparations is the campaign. And of course, we're going to be side by side with the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which we're very proud of. All right, so let's begin at the beginning, where we establish some context for this subject. Before we can discuss reparations itself, we first need to address, in my opinion, the context in which the need for reparation arose. Sir Hilary, I have heard you succinctly and eloquently summarize the historical and contextual underpinnings of slavery that formed the foundation of the reparations case on many, many occasions. And you do that brilliantly. I would like to lean on you once again to do so as we begin this discussion. And then Dr. Daniels, you can illuminate any fundamental differences in the context of the US experience. So Hillary.
Well, thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to be with my colleagues on this panel and also to engage your audience on this very important matter. When we speak of reparatory justice in the context of the African experience in the modern world, what we are talking about is the greatest crime that has been committed in respect of humanity in the last 300 to 400 years. We are looking at, in the first instance, a Western economic structure that sought to maximize its production, its profitability, and its income generation. And the way they went about doing that was to globally enslave millions of African peoples, not only in the Americas, but in other parts of the world. It was indeed a global economic system. But slavery and the chattel enslavement of Black people, and we're not speaking about slavery in generic terms. We are speaking about a specific kind of enslavement, which we call chattel slavery, where you convert people into property, you deny their humanity, they are not part of the human family, they belong to a special species of property. You legislate that, you build that into your constitution, and you take millions of people, reduce them to the level of chattel real estate and property, exploit them for your own enrichment. And at the end of that process, you said you're going to walk away from it. It's in the past, it's behind you. That historical experience is very much a contemporary experience. The legacies of that crime and the diversity of the crime, the legacies are with us all around us today. You and I, we are very much still the victims of this. So we cannot disconnect that historical circumstance where this enormous crime was perpetrated from the consequences of it today in my time and in your time, in our parents' time. This is the world in which we live today. And as such, we are entitled to justice. The crimes must be litigated, they must be settled. And until it is done, the challenge of victims feeling a lack of trust and commitment in the modern world, and those who believe that they could brush this under a carpet, walk away from it, don't look back, that is not the way in which the world can proceed.
Well, excellent. You did it again. I will say that a couple of points that you mentioned there are worth illumination. First, I think it's very important to have an understanding of what chattel slavery means, or chattel in terms of property. Can you expand on that a bit more? I mean, and what that really, the significance of that?
Okay, well, you know, there's a general tendency in the literature from the Bible all the way through to our modern time to use the word slavery very loosely. And generally speaking, the word slavery has tended to be used to explain all kinds of exploitation. In some societies, it was said that wives are enslaved by their husbands. In some societies, it is said that children are the slaves of their parents. So you have a loose gathering of different kinds of oppression. And the best way to look at this is to imagine a pool in which there's a shallow end and a deep end. The shallow end might be various ways in which you can exploit people, whether they're political prisoners, whether they're convict laborers. There are different ways in which you can extract labor out of people. There's a shallow end, but the deepest end of that pool is called chattel slavery. And that was the system that was specifically made available to the African peoples, where they were chattel enslaved because they were Black. So they were racially profiled for this deepest end of involuntary labor, the deepest end. Their humanity was taken away from them. They're the only people in human history who were classified as non-human,
Mhm.
as property under the laws of the various colonies, as real estate and chattel. That, of course, really means that that person is converted by law as a unit of property, and they can serve all of the forms of property. What do you know about property? You can buy it,
Yes.
you can sell it, you can lease it, you
Yes.
can mortgage it, you can use it as cash, you can pass it on to your children, you can use it in a transaction. It has all the forms of property, and is exactly what happened to millions of Black people in the modern world, converted into a unit of property with all of the attendant features and characteristics of property. No human identity, just a market asset. And that, my dear friend, has never happened before to any other group of people. It was specific to the African people. And now we are still living in that legacy that lives do not matter, because under law, you cannot rip property. So the Black women were racially plundered, and you cannot, under law, you could not rape an enslaved Black woman because you cannot rape property. She was no different from a horse, a cow, a goat. So also, the children had no identity. The children were passed down to the owners of the mother. So the mother reproduced property, property reproduced property. So all of those characteristics have had tremendous social impact on family life, on racial identity, on your pride, on your culture, on your dignity, on your self-worth, how society view your value as a human being, how they can extinguish your life without remorse. These are all the legacies of 400 years of the property usage of African peoples.
Indeed, indeed, and for all those reasons, I wanted you to elaborate on that, because to be characterized as chattel is a very, very significant thing, as you just mentioned. Dr. Daniels, I did mention that to the extent from the U.S. side you wanted to illuminate on some of what Sir Hilary just talked about, this would be an opportunity to do so.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just say, I'm also delighted to be a part of this panel, to you, Brother Morton, and to the esteemed, legendary Hugh Riley, and to our leaders from the Caribbean, Dr. Hilary Brown, and the acknowledged global leader of the reparations movement, without question, Professor Sir Hilary Beckel. It is really an honor to be on this panel. Let me just say that a couple of things I would chime in. I think it's important to just, at the level of the extraction of wealth, to at least quote two sons of the Caribbean. Sir Eric Williams' classic work, Capitalism and Slavery. And I think by far, for me, the most important and powerfully written is, of course, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, which really talks about the way in which the extraction of labor built really the Western world. In the US, Manning Marable did a piece called How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And so today, when you hear about Lloyd's of London and Barclays Bank and all of these institutions, there's a direct relationship to that. And so that, I just wanted to throw that in. From the perspective of Africans in the US, totally agree with Professor Beckles that there was a unique form of property, a law. It was called chattel law in the United States that regulated what was called this peculiar form of property. And so that is an important point to make. But I also think there's another aspect that we need to look at, and we need to quote Malcolm on this. Malcolm said, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us."
Indeed.
But he also said something else that is really profound that people don't often grasp, particularly in terms of the peculiarity of the ma'afa, as we have called it, on people of African descent in the US. He said that of all the crimes committed by Europeans against Africans, the greatest was to take our names. And what he meant by that is, when I teach my classes, there's something called cultural aggression. Because the experience that we all took was the shock, of course, of being captured, the shock of the march to the sea, and then, of course, the dread Middle Passage. Within the context of the U.S., however, there was a conscious, calculated effort to de-Africanize the African. Calculated. And to have us respect all things white, no matter what it was, who, what station, above all, to be obedient to all things white, to systematically deal with trying to beat out of us our culture in relationship to music, our language, our religions, because Europeans soon came to understand that these were mechanisms by which we could organize ourselves. And so there was an effort to try to in fact, de-Africanize the African, because if we were able to play the drum, we would communicate with each other with those drums. If we could sing our songs and practice our religion, we could do organized rebellions in that form as well. There was even a systematic policy of dispersion, so that there were not too many Africans of the same ethnic group on the same plantation for the same reason. And the effort to force us to speak English so they could always be listening to what we had to say. And so that's an area of study that I often point out that needs much more inquiry, because the attack on identity, I mean, culture is the stuff that makes a people stick. If you attack culture, people become unstuck. Mm-hmm. And so we have been, ever since we arrived on these African shores, been attempting to build a new African community out of the diverse ethnic groups. Because after all, let's recognize, ethnicity and culture is more important than skin color. I mean, people organize even on the African continent on the basis of ethnicity and culture. So when you began to disperse people in the way that we were dispersed, it was about really, being really disoriented. But fortunately, because of who we are and the resiliency we have, they tried, but they did not completely succeed. So the quest has been to build a new African community in the U.S. out of these disparate elements that came together. And in that regard, you had, the so-called quasi-free blacks, people like Richard Allen and others, who took it upon themselves. And they knew, they started by saying the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. They had a sense of that identity early on. And they were committed to liberating their enslaved African brothers and sisters. And on the plantation itself, the ingenious ability to be right up in Massa's face and sing songs that had dual purposes. So before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Or it's to steal away. And all of these songs that had a Christian purpose, to be sure, but to be right up in the master's face and to communicate about rebellions and where the meeting was going to be and so forth. And they could not. So out of this also came some unique kinds of African creativity, like the blues, like jazz, and things that we also could create out of these residual vestiges of Africa that still remain. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation, because no question about the extraction of wealth. In fact, on this side, the triangular trade on this side, which really helped to build. You talk about the Kennedys were great folks, but they built their fortunes beginning with the textile industry and the whiskey industry, came right out of the triangular trade and whatnot. So yes, these are all things. And the other thing that Nana Patricia Newton, one of someone that Professor Bill Beckles knows, and she is certainly a great favorite of his. She talks about the epigenetic transgenerational passing on of trauma, that it is in our DNA, that some of the things that we're now suffering from, even in terms of internally in the United States now, the fratricide, the violence, is really a function of this crime, this greatest crime committed against humanity. So this is some of it's all the same system, but the manifestations in different places were a little bit different. Okay. So in the United States of America, just finally, when I often talk to people, and if the Italian came with cultural continuity, language intact. religion intact, and certainly skin color is something, or the Irishman or whatever. We, of course, suffered from cultural aggression, cultural discontinuity, and we have been struggling even to this moment to sort of overcome that. Hence the evolution from African to colored to Negro to Malcolm reminding us that we were Afro, that we were African Americans, that just because, as Queen Mother Moore said, a cat has kittens in the oven does not make them biscuits. We may not know the specificity of the particular ethnic group, but there is no such thing as Negro land. And if you're talking about Black land, it's Africa. So we are people of African descent.
Okay, Dr. Daniels, we're going to have to interrupt you for a second there. Let me just jump to an area, and Dr. Frederick Morton said at the beginning, or we should have emphasized that sometimes it's important for all of our panelists to jump in if something piques your interest. But let's just change gears for a second. One of the most stated areas of opposition to reparations in this whole discussion is, oh, slavery happened a long time ago, get over it. Some objectors also like to ask, well, why should I be responsible for the actions of my forefathers? Now, I know you've heard all of this and time again. What in the case of the United States often happens, this is a very popular refrain, you've had a Black president. What more do African Americans want? So how do you, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Daniels, and give me a succinct answer, but I know that Sir Hilary has an opinion on this, and Dr. Hilary Brown is thinking that she's escaping, and she isn't, because
you better remain comfortably seated.
Dr. Daniels.
Oh, it's very simple, and that is that if you just look at the scenario we just painted, and I teach this, and when I talk to my students, I'm not a great economist, but there's something called the multiply effect and the acceleration principle. So there were people in New England, and there's a woman whose name is Katrina Brown. She has a documentary called Traces of the Trade. And she talks about how her family was enriched through the engagement in the European slave trade. So it goes something like this. If you were in New England and the triangular trade was flourishing, you didn't have to be directly involved in the slave trade. You were a beneficiary of that economic growth taking place because of it. Now, it was not equal. Those who were at the commanding heights of capital and finance obviously enriched themselves more than others who were at the level of labor. But in some degree, all white people benefited, and they have benefited in the textile industry, in the steel industry. I mean, the whiskey, there are all these, because that is the nature of the multiplier effect, right? And so, and the reality becomes that if you are in that circumstance, you are able to pass on the benefits of that accumulated wealth across generations. And so there's the notion of cross-generational benefits and cross-generational deficits. I could talk more about that in terms of other parts of it, but that is the short answer is you didn't have to be directly involved. The same thing in England, Barclays Bank or Lloyd's of London, all of those jobs that were generated out of that growth, a lot of people were not directly involved, but they benefited. And so it's not about their individual culpability. It is about the fact that all people benefited at some level.
So Hilary, what say you?
Well, first you recognize that the purpose of enslavement was plunder. And you plunder people for the purpose of extracting wealth, accumulating wealth at the level of the family, at the level of the community, the institution, the race. It's about plunder. And plunder evolves over time. So let's say you had 300 years of plundering under the model we call slavery. Then you revise that model, you pass a law called emancipation and said, okay, we are changing the model, and we're going to call that free society. But the plunder continues against the descendants for another 200 years. And then you come to your own lifetime, your own personal lifetime. Here we are in 2020. You and I were born and raised on an island called Barbados, which was where this all started in a big way. But when I was a child, 90% of the wealth on this island was owned by the white community. 90% of the wealth, 80% of the land was owned by the descendants of the slave owners. So to say it was a long time ago, it's really quite ridiculous, because you are walking around your society and you're seeing the unequal distribution of wealth that is linked to a history and its plunder. Then you take a simple issue. 1834, the British government decided to emancipate the Africans. And to do so, they borrowed 20 million pounds, which was 40% of the national expenditure, to pay these slave owners compensation for property. Now, when did the British government finally paid off that bond? They borrowed the 20 million from the Rothschilds Financial Corporation in 1834. And that bond was not paid by the British government until 2017. So just 3 years ago, the British government was still paying for the slave bond that they borrowed. So I lived in Britain for quite a while and I worked there for a little bit. So my taxes that I was paying to Her Majesty's government was being used to pay the slave bond that compensated my great-great-great-grandparents. So it is all very much in the present. It's around you, the empirical evidence, the financial evidence. So an argument that says, oh, it was a long time ago, not true. And finally, there's the question of something called the will, that magnificent instrument whereby you can pass wealth on to your children and your grandchildren and all of them, and you can accumulate this wealth and pass it down the line, as Ron said, intergenerational wealth, pass down the line. So you inherit all of that. The institutions, the best universities, the best schools. So you inherit access to all of this. And the descendants of those who have been plundered do not have access. And therefore, that model came into the 20th century. It came into the 21st century. It is very present indeed.
Today, Frederick.
In fact, I remember hearing you talk about in very great detail about that impact. Post-colonial Caribbean was left 60%, I believe you said, illiterate. The slaves, the health issues that were left here, which is hypertension and diabetes. In fact, I think I heard you at some point talk about that the Caribbean, in fact, is the amputation capital per capita of the world, and these are direct links to the impact. Am I going in the right direction in terms of talking about that impact?
These are the contemporary expressions of all of this history that shows that the action and the consequence represent a single process. So you cannot disaggregate the process and say that was an accident, that was the event, and these are the consequences, and they belong to two different worlds.
Right.
I mean, they're all the same process. Let me give you an example. Just a few weeks ago, I was going through some documents from the British archives. Jamaica was getting ready for independence, became independent in August 1962. Month before, July, the Premier of Jamaica goes to England and he goes to negotiate what is called the settlement. Britain, you have colonized this island for 307 years. You have extracted all of the wealth out of the island for 307 years. And now we want to have independence. We want to go on and take care of ourselves. They go to England. They place on the table an agenda that would transfer some of that wealth back to Jamaica to begin the conversation about nation building. the British government made it clear, we owe you nothing.
Mhm.
We're going to give you nothing of any substance. We're going to give you no capital grant. We're going to give you no development funding. Just go back to Jamaica. If you want your independence, you have it on your own terms, go. The remarkable thing about that conversation is that one of the persons in that delegation, the late Honorable Edward Seago, who later became Prime Minister of Jamaica, he was a young minister in 1962. And he said to the British government, oh, hold on a second. Look at the situation. Look at how you have left Jamaica. 3/4 of the people cannot read or write. We have education spaces. We have education spaces for 7% of the children. We have places in schools for 7% of the children. We have housing for 10% of the people. We have running water for 20% of the people. How are we going to build a nation out of this? And that is why the issue of taking responsibility. The Jamaican people said, well, okay, despite how badly you have left us, we have the confidence that we will go out there and try this by ourselves. And Jamaicans have built a great, fantastic nation out of that rubble. So they took responsibility for themselves. But at the same time, the colonial mess that they inherited has been like a millstone around their necks. You know, the poverty that Britain left behind. So reparations is really about that. It says you need to come back to the scene of the crime that you have committed,
Mhm.
and participate in cleaning up this mess that you have left. We're not asking you to come back and take responsibility for it. We are saying you come back and partner with us to help to clean up this mess that you have created.
Mhm.
And until you do so, we are going to continue to press the claim for our share, for our justice. So what it says to young people today, this is what it says to young people. Don't disconnect from this. Your
Right.
parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents have been demanding this for 200 years. It is now your turn to demand it. And I want to make one final point about this issue of young people. Every moment in this reparations movement has been led by young people. Young people have historically been the ones leading this charge. I mean, when we listen to the situation around John Lewis, 23 years old, giving that great speech, the Black Lives Matters movement, young people, every moment in the reparatory justice movement, young people have been the ones. Now, we oftentimes forget how young Martin Luther King was. We forget how young Malcolm X. We
Mhm.
forget how young Walter Rodney, Maurice Bishop. These were all young people. And it has always been a movement of the young people. So we know that you have a lot of young people
Yes, indeed.
who are part of your program. This
Indeed.
is about them. And I know that they're listening and they're going to take responsibility as young people because they have always done so.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm very, very glad that you made that point. We do have a young demographic and young in heart demographic. You know that the Caribbean, we don't age in the Caribbean. But
Don't
it,
crack.
yeah, that's right, Dr. Daniels. Uh, Dr. Brown, I wanted to bring you in. I know Hugh has a couple of questions to ask you about your work at CARICOM in particular. But I wanted to bring you in on a point that Dr. Daniels made about culture and the importance of culture. And when it was ripped away from our African descendants, what that did to our identity. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the role of culture then, now, with regards to this entire issue of what it did to the souls of African people when that culture was ripped away.
Well, thank you so much, Frederick. And it's also such a pleasure and an honor for me to join this panel. And thank you so much for the partnership and this opportunity to have this wonderful conversation with the panel, but also with the audience. And I think Sir Hillary was spot on, with the points he was making to youth, because knowing that you have a youthful audience and recognizing that youth are so important to the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and also recognizing that we have a duty to ensure that the next generation carries that torch, keeps up the battle, and never stops fighting until we have realized reparations.
Indeed.
And as we say in CARICOM, there is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. So the first thing I really wanted to say was how important it is for us to connect with young people through this platform. And I was fascinated too by the discussion that we were just having on the legacy of harm, and the issue of culture that you have raised is so central to that discussion. Because when we, in addition to all the points that have been so very well elaborated so far, we're looking at, besides the intergenerational poverty, there's this issue of the lack of racial pride. The, the way in which our young people, all our people, we know the challenges that people of African descent have had, with skin color, with their hair. They don't think they're beautiful.
Mhm.
They don't think black is beautiful. Everything that is, figurative in our environment affirms whiteness as um,
Indeed.
as positive and as the ideal, and all is linked with that cultural and psychological scarring, of um, 300 years of feeling that you are less than, you are chattel, you're not equal to, you're not beautiful, you don't have any sense. And so this is the kind of scarring that we are battling with to the present. And we know especially that our young people, we all pass through that phase at some point. We know too that wherever we go, this is how we know it's systemic. Wherever we go in the world, we see people of African descent at the bottom of the social ladder. They always have the most menial jobs. They always can't make ends meet. When we have the pandemic, they are the essential workers. So right across the board. So these are all some of the things that we're still living with. There's a culture of violence, violence against children, violence against women, violence against each other, coming again out of a system that was brutal. Everything was settled with violence, with whipping, with amputations, uh, you name it. So there are many things that as a people we're still grappling with. And as you rightly said, that identity, that affirmation, and this is why reparations is so important. It is about healing. It is about affirming. It is about going after justice for the people of the region in a way that they have never had it before, because this is an open wound that has a debt that has never been paid. And it is so important for us to get that cultural certitude that Professor Rex Nettleford spoke about, that severely damaged in the experience of enslavement. And if I can just make one little point on that, because I've heard all of our other speakers, they have used the term enslavement and being enslaved. And I think it's important to point out to our young people that we don't speak about ourselves as being slaves and the descendants of slaves, because our people in Africa were leaders in maths and science and in so many areas before they were enslaved. So we need to speak about enslavement as opposed to being the descendants of slaves. So I'll leave it as those as my introductory comments for now. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to follow up by asking, but so you represent, Dr. Brown, an institution, CARICOM, which is 15 mostly independent sovereign nations in the Caribbean. But how can the Caribbean possibly, or can the Caribbean possibly speak with one voice on this issue when among Caribbean countries, there are still parts of Britain and France and the Dutch. And so we've got an argument being made by the descendants of people who were enslaved. And in fact, parts of the Caribbean are still under the rule of the UK and the Dutch and the French and so on. How does that all come together? Because certainly a region needs to speak with one voice on an issue that is fundamentally requiring the strongest, loudest, most unified approach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, you know, the historic decision that was taken by the CARICOM heads of government in 2013 to establish a regional reparations commission to me, it is as though we have come full circle back to our starting point, because the foundation on which CARICOM has come together as a region, as a family, that foundation is our common historical and cultural experiences. This is the foundation of the regionalism. This is why we are able to reach out to each other to see the benefit of working together, recognizing that we're all small. But because of our shared experiences, our shared aspirations, this is the foundation of our regionalism. So to have CARICOM now pursue reparations as a grouping, as a body, is, in my view, doing justice and really paying homage to that foundation which has brought us together. CARICOM has never been reticent in being a thought leader and an activist on the global stage. We have advanced non-communicable diseases in the UN. We have been some of the loudest voices on climate change and 1.5 to stay alive. And in this era of reparations, we're also a thought leader. So our chair, Sir Hilary, and many of the other historians that we have on the commission are providing leadership globally on this issue. And our heads of government voted unanimously at that meeting in 2013 to pursue reparations from the European nations, because they recognize that this is the justice that they need to go for the people of this region, and to affirm their dignity and the dignity of the ancestors, and to really, address this crime against humanity that we are still suffering from today. So in many ways, and I could even also mention that it was CARICOM that co-sponsored the resolution, UN General Assembly resolution, that recognized the 200th anniversary of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and recognized the 25th of March as the day to commemorate that. And it was in fact Professor Rex Nettleford who addressed the UN on that auspicious occasion. So this is an area in which we are giving global leadership, and the member states of CARICOM are rallied around this issue. So, so I have to say it's a really very proud moment in the history of the region and in the history of the movement.
That's fantastic, Dr. Brown. I mean, we do recognize the very critical role that CARICOM plays in so many issues, and wish to commend the commission on that very fine work, and know that Temple Networks is here to support that and get that information out. I want to repeat that for my young audience so that they know that
can I comment on what?
Of course you can.
Because I want the audience to know that when you start talking about unity, how courageous it was for the 15 nations who are still in what might be called a neo-colonial position to have the audacity to confront the former colonial powers and say, we demand reparations for native genocide, which was a principal position, and African enslavement. Now, the reason why I want the audience to understand that is because there is a synergistic relationship between the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the National African American Reparations Commission. It was because of the courageous visionary stance that was taken by CARICOM at a time when the reparations movement, because it ebbs and it flows, it ebbs and it flows. Well, it was in one of those periods with President Obama was president. There was debates about, can you raise this when he's president? And all these things were happening. When this decision was taken, I can tell you, we sat down with Congressman John Conyers and we began to plan how we could cooperate in a way that would help to strengthen the reparations movement in the United States. And that's exactly, what occurred. So CARICOM has a 10-point reparations program. We have a 10-point reparations program that is in fact modeled after, it's not exactly the same, but we looked and we modeled it after the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So I just wanted to make that clear that our sisters and brothers in the Caribbean, are leading the way, have helped to inject new life, and it's a synergistic relationship. We've been going back and forth and having different functions and so forth. And it is a wonderful, powerful relationship that I just wanted to acknowledge.
Well, I'm certainly glad that
allow me to intervene here because I need to, as a historian, I need to make clearer, or I should say, correct my friend Ron when he said that that the African American community took this concept in part from the CARICOM Commission. This is not true. We took it from them because when we were formulating the CARICOM 10-point plan, we had as our template Foreman's plan. Ron, do you remember the George Foreman plan?
That's right. Yes. Oh,
that
yes.
Was the plan that came out of your reparations movement in the 60s and 70s. We went to your plan and we brought it to our region and reformulated it. So in a sense, the conversation has been it has been a cross-fertilization. So there we go. We need to put that. But there's one additional I want to make, which is relevant to what Ron was saying. And he was talking about the movement, the African American culture. One of the misconceptions that I think Euro-American and historians have told this myth about the trade in enslaved African people was a trade in labor. That what came across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean was labor. Let me tell you, the so-called slave trade was a migration of Black intellect. It was a migration of Black skills, intellect, philosophy, art, culture, music, drama, theology, governance. It was a migration of the African intellectual tradition and cosmology that was brought from one place to another. So yes, so when they brought the labor, they brought all that other stuff. And it is that other stuff that has allowed us to be here today, to be who we are. It is that other stuff that we brought that has allowed me to become a historian, that has allowed you to become a journalist, that allows us to become all of these other things, because we are standing in the tradition of what our ancestors brought with them. Yeah. So yes, they brought the labor, but they brought a lot of other stuff. Indeed. And we found that being expressed in all the art, the music, the literature, the philosophy, who we are. And when we speak of Black culture, you're talking about one of the most incredibly rich humanist value system that exists on the planet. It is the most complex sense of philosophy and theory and art and humanity and gender. All of that stuff in the Black world is very, very developed and matured. And that is, I think, what a lot of people are afraid of.
Yes.
That's what they're afraid of.
Yes.
They're afraid largely of giving complete validation to what they call Blackness. And the notion of Blackness is very rich, and our young people should embrace it. because it's about how you relate to the environment, how you relate, how we were all socialized to respect the vegetation, the flowers, the art, the ground, the connection to the earth. All of these things we were socialized to respect because that is our African philosophy. Now we have climate change. We have people wanting to destroy the planet. The African people don't want to destroy the planet. The African people have always wanted to live in harmony with the planet.
Absolutely.
We love trees and we love vegetation. We love the rain and we love all of these things. Our whole world is built around the embrace of Mother Earth. And that is why Blackness is about the future of humanity, the future of the world. Black people do not go around telling people that they are inferior, because Africa had always had all kinds of races and colors. Africa is the first multicolor, multiracial civilization. So we are accustomed to diversity of color and shapes. And guess what? African people do not dismiss their offspring. African people have children with all the other races. We have children with Chinese and Japanese and white people. We have children with everyone, but we always embrace our children. We say they're ours, no matter who we have them with. We embrace them. We don't say, okay, our offspring. We have never said that our offspring is lesser than. Our motherhood had always embraced its offspring. So we don't classify them as different. They're ours. And thus, in our cosmology, we have a humanity that embraces the world. That is what came across the Atlantic with the slave trade as well. That came across the Atlantic, and it's alive and well. That is why we do not expose racism. We have always said the world is horizontal. The world is, cultures are horizontal. You have African cultures, European cultures, Asian cultures, and they're all on the level playing field of human diversity. So we respect diversity and we put them all on the level playing field, that they're all equal. It's the Europeans who came with this notion that they are vertical. You can stack them one on top, one on the bottom. We have never thought like that. We have always said it's a flat world. All cultures are equal, beautiful, diverse, not one better than the other. They are different, but different does not mean better than. It just means different. So we have a different philosophy, my brother. Tell your young people to feel the richness that is flowing through their veins and their families about the planet, about the world, about humanity. So when we say we want reparations, there's no anger. There's no anger. All we're saying is we want justice. There's no vengeance. There is no vengeance. We want to heal. We want justice to heal so we can move on. And we have to move on with justice. But we have no vengeance. We have no anger, because we are not ready for that world. We just want our share of the world's resources that are owed to us and due to us. We want to be like everyone else, enjoy what this planet has to offer us.
Right, right. Well, I got to say that was so needed to be said. That we brought so much more than labor. I think that point is very much missed in a lot of these discussions. The richness of who we are and what we are came from that same place.
Absolutely.
Right, which is an extraordinary thing.
Let me tell you, we have on my campus here in Barbados, we have a monument here called Quo's Quest. And it is called Quo's Quest because in 1797, a child from the Congo was delivered on a slave ship here in Barbados and was sold at the age of 4. His parents were killed in a slave raid in Congo. They picked up the child from the village, threw the child on a slave ship. The child arrived in Barbados and was bought by a slave owner as a toy for his 4-year-old son to play with.
Wow.
Then suddenly they realized that this Quor was a mathematical genius and he could do computations in his head that adults could not do.
Amazing.
And they were just shocking. Oh, how can this little child be doing these computational skills? And later on, they realized he was just a natural born genius, and he became a teacher in the Sunday school, and they gave him a big job in the church, and so on. History, I'm a historian. The historical record is filled with this stuff about these gifted children, these gifted people, these people with this genius for this or for that. And what do? Can we stuff it out? Can we destroy it? Sometimes they could, sometimes they could not. But what they were surrounded by on those slave plantations was a phenomenal intellectual construct of capacity. And that is something that we have to remember. So we're not today acquiring education for the first time to become articulate. No, we had that stuff down packed, just waiting for the opportunity.
Right. Awesome. Before we proceed to discuss the 10-point plan, which both of you, Dr. Daniels and Sir Hilary mentioned, from the CARICOM Commission and of course from the National African American Commission as well. And what's very heartening about that discussion is how well both commissions are collaborating. That is extremely heartening. The idea of unity is something that sometimes gets lost, and to see it here in full force, or to hear about it in full force, is a very heartening thing. But before we go there are some points in these discussions that are so shocking, that like chattel slavery that we discussed early on in the discussion. But there was something that you touched on as well, Sir Hilary, earlier on, that I want to sort of make clear in this discussion. And that is reverse reparations, so to speak, right? So this whole idea that the slaves or the enslaved, to Dr. Brown's very, very good point, has been making the case from that time for reparations, and indeed have not just been making the case, but actually were forced to make reparations of their own for their freedom. That story, or that fact, that historical fact, is not a story, it's a historical fact, is something that I think is profound and needs to be said. I know you know what I'm referring to.
Absolutely.
From the British Empire. I would love to say it, but you say it so much better. Can you please enunciate?
And let me just say, there's a couple of other examples that we need to talk about too, because we need to talk about, in the US, there was a similar scenario, and we cannot leave out Haiti.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So Hilary and then Dr. Daniels on those points.
Well, Ron is correct. Every act of so-called emancipation in the Western world required that the slave owners would receive compensation for the value of their chattel. And in every case, the enslaved people said, how about us? We are the ones who deserve reparations and compensation. You have taken our labor. We have a human right to our labor and the benefits of our labor. You have taken that and you have used that. And now you want to end the legal process. We are the ones to be compensated. In the case of the British, that is what the enslaved said. The enslaved in the British colony says, how about us? In fact, the emancipationists actually said that it is the enslaved people who should receive reparations and not the enslavers. So you go through the British parliamentary papers and you have this argument, the enslaved people are the ones who should receive the compensation. But guess what? The enslavers who control the parliament said the reparations that they are going to get is their emancipation, and they should be grateful for that.
Amazing.
They should be grateful that they're being emancipated. That is their reparations.
That's their prize.
They are going to take the money. Ron mentioned the first model. The first model was Haiti. The Haitis fought their revolution. They won their freedom. It was a lavish slave colony in the region. They had 380,000 enslaved people in that colony. They won their independence. And guess what happened? 1825, they declared their independence in 1804. 1825, the Black people in Haiti are celebrating the 21st anniversary of their independence. Big moment in Port-au-Prince. People are celebrating its 21 years of nationhood, of independence, of citizenship, and they're celebrating. And in the midst of all of that, the warships of France and the United States appeared off the coast of Haiti and told them, if you want to have another annual celebration, you better make sure you pay reparations to us for the property that you have taken from us. And you, the government, all of you who are in the government, you once belong to us. All of you who are ministers of government, there was a time not long ago when you were our property and we want to have our money back. So the Haitian people had a choice. Either they suffer another invasion, this time with the full support of the United States, or they do what they were asked to do, and they signed the agreement to pay reparations. So they were the first to pay reparations. Then all of the other European countries then said, that is the model. That is the model. So the English got their compensation. The French gave compensation to slave owners. The Dutch gave compensation to the slave owners. And right across this Americas, the enslaved people got nothing. They were told that they had to be grateful that their reparations was the emancipation itself. But we know how that process went. So we have an ethical case to look at. And I can tell you this, if you take the British and French and Dutch models, they did an interesting calculation. This is how the British made their calculation. They said we have 700,000 enslaved Black people in our empire, mostly the Caribbean. The value of that in the Caribbean is 45 million pounds. All of the Black people in the British Caribbean, that was their value, 45 million pounds. If you want to make that calculation, that was about 80% of the British national income. About 80% of the British national income for that year was the equivalent to how many Black people they owned in the Caribbean. And they said, we'll make a deal, and this was the deal. We will give the slave owners 20 million in cash. We will give them 20 million in cash, and then we will give them 25 million in additional free labor after emancipation. So what they did, they gave the Black people their freedom and then said, you have to work for free for another 4 years to give 25 million in-kind labor so that you paid off your full value. That is how the British, and they all did that. All of the Europeans did that. This is how they totally plundered the Black people out of their basic right to their human labor. Reparations can begin right there. We can begin the calculation right there.
Right.
The 45 million that we were worth, maybe today it is worth about $2 trillion. Maybe we can begin right there. But the point is, that calculation will stay in the background, but it's not going to go away. And I said it on more than one occasion, this reparations movement is going to be the largest global political movement of the 21st century. And we are now warming up. We haven't got started yet.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
We are in the infancy of this movement. This is going to be the greatest movement of the 21st century. And it's going to cascade and get stronger and stronger until there is justice through negotiations. And Ron will be there when all of this is happening.
Hopefully all of us, right? We'll be right there behind you. Ron, you'd like to add to that?
No, just one little addendum. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, of course, it was a political and economic statement about on the part of Abraham Lincoln, who was quite brilliant in how he crafted it. Because it only applied to those nations that were not in active, who were not against, only those who were in active belligerency. So if you were not in active belligerency against the Union, as in Maryland, and there were several other states. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to you, and you still were able to keep your enslaved Africans. Now, upon the passage of the 13th Amendment, what they did was, for those states, not the others, for those states, they actually paid compensation to them for the loss of their property. And so it was a modified version, but it's the same principle.
Right.
And they were rewarded for being loyal. They were rewarded, you know, for not breaking away. We'll take care of you. You can keep your, and we will compensate you. And of course, the other reality is that, you know, there was the notion in this country of the 40 acres and a mule, Sherman's field order that would have provided 40 acres and a mule in terms of an endowment, which was recognized anywhere from all the way down the coast to Florida, from South Carolina to Florida. And that actually passed the legislature, but it was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. So the idea, it was recognized that this was important. In fact, they were really concerned with, if Black people get reparations, what will happen with working class white people? Will they also begin to make a demand? But to this more definitive point, you know, there was a version of compensating the slave masters in those states that were not in active belligerency with the Union.
Right, right. Well, vile is the only word that you can possibly conjure up for that.
But let me add one final point before I go. The principle of reparatory justice is built into international law.
Right.
All the major crimes against humanity that have been committed in the recent centuries have been dealt with in the reparatory justice framework. Most of them. The only people who have not received reparatory justice in the context of the enormity of this crime are the Black people. I was at the British Parliament in 2007 when they were debating this matter. And the consensus in the British Parliament, in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, was yes, we did commit these crimes. Yes, we should participate in a process of reparations. But the crime is so large. The crime is so large that we wouldn't even know how to begin to deal with it. There will be no end to it if we start to consider reparatory justice for the size of that crime. And therefore, since the crime is so large and the discussion is so unimaginable, therefore the best thing to do is to close it and move on. And that is a unilateral decision. Now, that is precisely the point of white supremacy, that you can unilaterally decide that a crime is too large to discuss, and therefore you will take it upon yourself to close the conversation and say, let's move on. That is what power is all about. And that is what the British Parliament decided. And I sat there in amazement. And the remarkable thing about that also is that there were 2 Black people in the House of Lords.
That's a whole other story.
Who agreed with that? Now, so that is one aspect of it. But the logic of it, the logic of that white supremacy position that this crime is too large to litigate, and if you start to litigate, how would you do it? What kind of model would you have? What kind of strategy? It is beyond the imagination, and therefore let's close off and move on. The logic of that and the significance of that is that the underlying argument is that they are not deserving. There is still that strong political view that Black people are not deserving of this. They're not entitled to it, or they are not deserving of it. So all the other people, whether it was the Native American peoples who've received some compensation, some land, some issues, whether they were the war crimes of the Second World War and the First World War, but the view is that we as a people, we are not deserving. And that is the white supremacy still alive in the 21st century, that we are not deserving and not entitled to something that all other people have had. And that is where we realize that if Black life really mattered to them, they would not be taking that decision that we are not deserving of this justice as a precondition to the celebration of our citizenship and our humanity. The refusal to discuss reparations with us, the refusal to apologize to us, has to do with the continuing perception that we are not deserving of it because we are inferior. And because you are inferior in their perception, you are not entitled to a conversation of equality, because reparations is a conversation of equality where the two sides sit down across the table and talk about the injustice and the legacy. But if you don't have the perception of these people as your equal, worthy of that conversation, you will not have it. You will not have that conversation. And this is why they issue statements of regret and they don't issue statements of apology. And you know what a statement of regret is? The difference is, here's the difference between a statement of regret and the apology. A statement of regret says, I committed a crime against you. I regret I've done it. Take care, goodbye. Imagine you are, let's say you are standing at your bus stop and a 6 foot, 300-pound man walk in front of you, step on your foot. Your toes are broken. You might be diabetic. They rush you to the hospital. They have to amputate your foot to save your life. The big man comes to the hospital and says, I regret that I have stepped on your foot. Take care. I wish you all the best. Goodbye. That is what a statement of regret is. No responsibility for the consequences. An apology, on the other hand, is that the big man comes and says, listen, I have stepped on your foot. I have damaged your foot. You've lost your mobility. You've lost your income. I'm terribly, terribly sorry. I will do my best to help you to survive. I will do my best to help you with your medical bills. I will do my best to help you maybe to get a job. I will do my best. I take responsibility for what I've done to you, and I will help you to recover, as opposed to the regret, I'm sorry, goodbye. And that is why the white countries do not want to issue the apology, because the apology calls for the admission of the consequence and a commitment to repair the harm that you have caused. To repair the harm that you have caused. That's the difference between the apology and the statement of regret. And which is why all the European countries have issued their statement of regret. We're sorry, goodbye.
Right. Well, I know, Hugh, before you proceed there, I know we're going to lose Sir Hilary in a bit. Sir Hilary has some other engagements. He will probably have to leave soon. But before you leave, I do want to touch on that question, which was going to be the last question of the panel, and that is on the question of litigation and the rule of law in all of this, right? So you many of these countries, as you've mentioned, fail to issue an apology because it could be some admission of guilt, perhaps even in a legal tribunal. What does that do to the ability to litigate these issues, right? As a lawyer, I mean, I am always curious with that question. We mainly appeal right now, Sir Hilary, to conscience and to fairness and to morality and to the ethical violations, when we know in many respects there are people without conscience, without any, a sense of fairness or morality. So that's where the law comes in at times, to force people to understand that there is some sense of justice. Is this matter, and will it come down to litigating this matter in the appropriate tribunal, international tribunals, etc.? Can you give us a little sense of where that is?
This is why when in the last 2 to 3 weeks, these British multinational financial corporations that were issuing public relations statements about apologies and sorry for this and all the kind of thing, because of their enrichment, drinking from the well of slavery and bringing that well of wealth into the present time, issuing their big dividends to their shareholders and all of that. We said to them, that is not enough. If you really want to speak about regret and apology, you have to say that you are going to trigger a conversation that seeks to negotiate how best to repair the harm. And that is where the conversation comes. Now, in the Caribbean, we have adopted a view that our first step along the road is going to be about diplomatic engagement. It's about conciliation. That is our stage one. Our stage one is that civil society and the European states, we have called for a summit. We have called for a summit with all of those European countries that were enriched out of this crime against humanity. Let us have a summit to discuss a development strategy to help repair the harm that you have caused. And we know what the harm is, the persistent poverty, the ill health, all of those issues. We know what they are because they continue to debilitate our efforts at transformation. Let's have a summit and work through a strategic plan, a development plan, where you can make some of that wealth available to impact positively the lives of people who are suffering the harm of your crime. We have said, let that circumstance play out. But at the same time, we are fully aware, as you have said, that in this world of capitalist greed, that notion of consciousness and responsibility in positions of leadership, it is a rare phenomenon.
Indeed.
And therefore, the way to receive justice is where the legal infrastructure provides strategies for that justice. So stage one, we have said, let us reconcile these matters in a civil society arrangement where we can have the meetings of minds and the diplomatic arrangement. But at the same time, as you say, we are exploring all of the legal options in the international legal structure that we could take our case in the event that we have to.
Indeed.
Because you have to recognize that ultimately justice for the victim can also be healing for those who have committed the crimes. And sometimes you have to bring them before the judge for them to look into themselves and to see that the future has to be about a settlement. And ideally, we prefer the settlement in the halls of diplomacy.
Right.
If we can't have that settlement in that arena, we will have to go and ask that before the judge and ask the judge for justice.
Indeed.
I need to comment on this piece too, and then I'm not a lawyer, but I'm the former executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and which is one of the premier public interest legal organizations in the United States. And we always considered lawsuits as an organizing tool. They might work, we might win, but one of the key elements of filing the lawsuit or the calling for the summit really is to galvanize the social movement. Now, I've been saying for quite some time that one of the, and let's look at our dear beloved brother, our new ancestor, John Lewis. The righteous irony of someone from Troy, Alabama, who was raised in the cotton fields, probably was a sharecropper, who rose to be a prominent, someone who was rejected, somebody who was bruised and battered, but came to be one who was in fact holding the United States of America to task in terms of this document called the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. What I see emerging, quite frankly, is an interesting dialectic that the sons and daughters who were colonized and who have now traveled to all of the diasporic countries, they're in Europe, they're in France, they're in Holland and whatever, they have become the contradiction. They have become the contradiction. I've been telling Professor Beckles, this is how it's going to run. They have become the contradiction in the streets. The Black Lives Matter movement is now erupting and exploding. And what is happening is there are a sufficient number of white allies who are of the laboring class. And then you now have Black is defined as from India, from Pakistan, from all of these places. They're now the contradiction. And I believe it is that dialectic that will drive, and eventually, because of the demand being made by the CARICOM Reparations Commission and because of the lawsuit, I think that more than anything else will drive this conversation, because there's also the ability to do economic sanctions. There's also the ability to withhold, to disrupt. But and it's at that level really that it seems to me that it's a kind of righteous irony that it is the sons and daughters of the Caribbean who have migrated, from those who were underdeveloped to the developed countries, who are now hammering at the gates. And are finding allies. So I kind of think that's one of the things that's going to be very, very powerful in terms of winning reparations. And I absolutely agree. And Dr. Julius Darby is saying this over and over again. He's saying the reparations is the movement of the 21st century. It is, and it's about the healing power of it. And it is true that those who once were the oppressors can also be healed from the experience as well. So I just wanted to add that dimension to the overall conversation about what I see as this dialectic that's now in play.
Excellent addition. Hugh, you'd like to jump in to probably have to say goodbye to Sir Hilary.
Yes, saying goodbye to you, my friend, and to Ron and Hilary, and of course you. Thank you for this opportunity to engage. I've enjoyed it tremendously, and I hope I made some contribution. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and we will do it again.
Yes, thank you, Sir Hilary.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we will have you back. Indeed,
okay.
we will have you back whenever your time allows.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hugh, you'd like to jump in at this point?
Well, I was actually, in the words of Sir Hilary, we're going to have to apologize and take responsibility for having another program, because we are pretty much out of time and haven't really touched on a number of matters that we know will need to be ventilated as we talk about the role of the church. We have to talk about the issue of monuments and symbols of slavery that still exist in the Caribbean and in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. We need to talk about the current protests against racial inequality and injustice that are happening, which themselves have helped to add more fuel to this discussion about reparations. And so there's a lot still to discuss, which we can't possibly cover in one segment. And
just got the promo for part 2.
Oh yes. Yes, exactly. We'll just clip that, send that out, and we're good to go next week, right?
Absolutely.
But
I will say,
I wanted to just highlight for our audience too that following on the discussion and the points raised by Dr. Daniels and Sir Hilary, that there's an important contextual factor too. A number of factors are coming together. You know, it's interesting how you'll be struggling for something for some time, and then suddenly there's a game changer. And, you know, for us at this juncture, it was the lynching, that public lynching of George Floyd that suddenly just tipped, was the tipping point that brought us to this point. But we're also operating in a broader context, and I don't think we speak about it enough. The UN declared the International Decade for People of African Descent. It started in January of 2015, and it goes on till December of 2024. And certainly the position of CARICOM is that, you know, significantly advancing the process of achieving reparations is an outcome that we would really like to see in this decade. The theme of the decade is people of African descent, recognition, justice, and development. And so a lot of what we're doing really is trying to actualize those aspects of the theme. And so we have come to a juncture where we have an incredible opportunity to almost take a quantum leap in what we're seeking to achieve. And I think it's very important to highlight, because very often people will ask the commission, what can we do? How can we get involved? And a very important part is your activism. It is your educating yourself on the issues, but it is also taking action. Look at the protests in the United States, how that has suddenly propelled, national reckoning, advancing HR 40, the reparations bill, and all of the discussions that are now happening. It is because the people took to the street and made a demand. And so that again is an important lesson that we need to take from this. That's what politicians respond to. It's people say they want something done, our leaders have to respond. So this particular moment where we are as well in the Caribbean with the reparations movement, it's an important partnership between governments and civil society, because we know that the civil society of the region, I'm talking about Rastafari, the Pan-Africanists, going way back from our artists from Burning Spear and Sparrow and Bob Marley, coming to the present with Junior Gong and Chronics, they all have kept alive for us that experience of slavery. They have been unrelenting. So they have been our consciousness, and they have kept that alive. And it is now that the governments are on board, and we need governments as well to be able to advance the case in Europe. It's governments that need to challenge other governments. So this juncture, and I've heard it spoken about in the American situation as well, that what's different about what's happening now is that you're seeing people of all races who are out in protest. I think what's different about what's happening in the region, in the Caribbean now, is that we have governments and we have civil society coming together in an important partnership to advance this process.
Excellent, excellent point. I will, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Braun. That's an excellent point. I want to take this opportunity right now, actually, as we're about to conclude, because quite frankly, we could be here till the end of the week, right, or the month. But the good part again is for those that might have just tuned in, that we're committed to doing this in a full series and really an ongoing series so that we can bring this information forward. And any one of these subjects can be a live discussion on its own. So we're going to work together to figure that out. But perhaps a good place, and Hugh, you'll tell me if I'm going in the right direction here, but a good place to conclude would be to talk a bit about the 10-point plan on each side, because that is the document from both commissions that sort of govern the direction or the strategic direction towards the goal of reparations. So if we could talk about the 10-point plans, perhaps we'll start with you, Hillary, and then we'll go to Dr. Daniels for the US side. And it doesn't matter who started it or who it came from. all that matters is that we're working together. Right?
We need to get through it rather quickly.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, well, very quickly, because the document is available. But the 10-point plan really is the elaboration of the objectives that the CARICOM Commission would like to get out of the reparations movement. It identifies key areas where we feel that we have been disadvantaged, our growth has been retarded, or we have been harmed. And so these are the areas that we want addressed. And it is also presented as an approach to community development. It is a development construct. CARICOM Reparations Commission is not looking at a model of individual payouts. We are looking at addressing the underdevelopment of the systematic underdevelopment of the region as a result of these hundreds of years of extraction of the wealth from the region through the free labor and fueling two industrial revolutions in Europe. And so when we talk about old money came from us, from our region. So the 10-point plan, very quickly, It starts with an apology, and Sir Hilary spoke very eloquently to that. You know, the commitment to non-repetition and to taking responsibility. Repatriation to Africa, we know that this is very important, particularly to the Rastafarian group, and for those who want to return to the motherland, that should be enabled. We have an Indigenous Peoples Development Program as a component, because the CARICOM Reparations Commission, although we have spent a lot of time talking about the component of enslavement, we are also pursuing reparations for Native genocide. And I think it would be wonderful in a future discussion on this program to really look more intensely at the Indigenous people's experience and what we're trying to do in that area. The cultural institutions that you mentioned earlier and the return of cultural heritage is another area. Addressing the health crisis, and you had engaged with Sir Hilary on that as well, on the type 2 diabetes, the hypertension, all of the health manifestations that we see in the region as a result of the intergenerational stress that's passed on, and the nutrition, the kind of diet that we had under slavery. Then, of course, education is a critical area that needs to be addressed. Enhancing historical knowledge and culture, the psychological rehabilitation that I spoke to, that ideology of racism that we have so internalized, that there is self-hate. And that's an area that is part of the 10-point plan. The right to development through the use of technology. And we know that there was a systematic policy on the part of Europe that there was to be no technological development in the Caribbean. They said not a nail was to be created in these colonies. So as a result, we have to buy every car, we have to bring in every computer, we have to bring in every cell phone. So our technological development, you know, has been retarded. And this is an area, science and technology is an area. And then finally, debt cancellation and monetary compensation. Reparations is restitution and repair. It is monetary as much as it is psychological, correcting the inaccuracies of history. And so it is multidimensional. But we know that the Caribbean is perhaps the highest indebted region in the world. And it significantly limits our government's ability. They have no fiscal space really to deal with so many of our priorities. And so whereas we're seeking monetary compensation, debt cancellation is also an area that we would be quite willing to negotiate over, because that would ease a significant burden on our countries in terms of where they are now. So those are the 10 areas that, that CARICOM is pursuing in the negotiations with Europe over reparations.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, as you mentioned, these can be found on the CARICOM Reparations Commission website. These are documents with a simple Google search that you can look up and get into it in depth. Dr. Daniels, on your side?
Yeah, very quickly, and let me just say that I also just wanted to comment quickly on the UN Decade of People of African Descent, because and perhaps the next program we can talk about this. The passage of HR 40 in the United States could well be one of the signature achievements of the UN Decade of People of African Descent, because we're framing it in that context as well. Let me quickly say that you can also find the 10-point program that NARC has developed on the IBW website, ibw21.org, ibw21.org. A great son of the Caribbean, Don Rojas, has helped to assemble the most extensive online reparations resource center in the world on the IBW website. I mean, you can spend days going through the website, the Reparations Resource Center. Let me also say that though we provide for the possibility of what we call direct benefits, we are also focusing primarily on what we call collective or community benefits. And in that regard, one of the things that we put forth is the concept of what we call a reparations trust authority as a means of collecting resources that could come from particularly the government, but also private sources. One of the other things that we clearly also articulate is that in terms of reparations, the party that inflicts the injury or the harm cannot define the remedy. It must be, in fact, defined by the injured party. And once we launch into it, I'm going to rip through these very fast, and you'll recognize some similarity. We would start with number one, a formal apology and the establishment of a Ma'afa Holocaust Institute. Number two, the right to repatriation and the creation of an African knowledge program, because within the United States, there are people who see self-determination not so much as incorporating or integrated into America, but the right to go back to Africa, to return to Africa. And we certainly want to support that idea, but we want them to go with something in hand as a part of that process. And then we talk about the right to land for social and economic development. We talk about a fund for cooperative enterprises and socially responsible entrepreneurial development. They're similar, but somewhat slightly different in terms of emphasis. Resources for health, wellness, and the healing of Black families and communities. Point 5. Point 6 is education for community development and empowerment. Number 7 is affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth generation. Number 8 is strengthening the Black community's information and communications infrastructure. Number 9, there's a discussion about, we were talking about faith communities. One of our commissioners, Dr. Ivor Carruthers, is the President General Secretary of the powerful Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and it's pushed very strongly about the need for historical memory. And so we talk about number 9, the preserving Black sacred sites and monuments. We see what Brian Stevenson has done in Alabama with the Lynching Museum. There are cemeteries. There are all kinds of places that need to be preserved. And finally, repairing the damages of the criminal injustice system. And there's a lot of points related to there, one of which is the rewriting of the 13th Amendment to erase from the 13th Amendment the notion that we're emancipated except in instances of bondage for criminal offenses. And people have seen that symbolically as being kind of a license to continue to incriminate Black people. So that's in short, the 10-point program. And you see the kind of synergy and relationship to our brothers and sisters in the CARICOM Reparations Commission.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Daniels. I wish to this moment to express on behalf of my co-host Hugh Riley and the entire Temple family, the audience that we serve, to express our sincere gratitude and thanks, heartfelt, for the time that we've spent together here. We are heartened to know that we're going to be spending a lot more time together. And we want our audience to know to stay tuned. We have a lot of information coming and a lot of opportunities for you to engage. Definitely go to the websites of both commission, start to read and get yourself educated on the issues, and we'll be back with you again soon. Hugh, would you like to add anything to what I've just said?
Just to add my thanks to our esteemed panel and to our audience for being so generous with their time as well. And to remind that if you've missed any part of it, you joined after we started, this all resides on YouTube. And so you can of course go there and capture the entire discussion. So part 2 and part 3 and so on, and parts 4, 5, and 6 will follow. But if you missed any part of this one, then it's on YouTube. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again on the Tempo Network.
Indeed, indeed. Any final words from you, Hillary?
Just to say my thanks too, and how really excited I am about this partnership. News stories are important, but with this kind of platform, we're really able to go more in depth and to discuss the issues in more detail and to ensure that, our audience can connect. So I really want to thank you both for the excellent work that you're doing and for making this available to us to connect with our audiences on this very important and pivotal moment in history. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. It has been a wonderful conversation. I really.
Thank you.
Indeed, our pleasure, our pleasure. Most welcome. Dr. Daniels.
No, I would just simply echo that. It was a great conversation, and we say luta continua, the struggle continues, and we look forward to the conversation continuing. Forward ever, backward never.
Never. Absolutely. And with that wonderful word, we say goodbye to our listening audience. Thank you, our viewing audience. Thank you for being here on another edition of The Road Ahead. We'll see you next time.